We're going to talk more about documentation to inform rather than inspire. You have industrial development, new materials and construction. They're going crazy in Europe. They want to see the new stuff, they want to see the old stuff, and photographers are doing it for them. Other documentary photography includes newsworthy events, daily life, ethnic customs, vanishing people, scientific and medical documentation, wars, and artifacts. Photographers are still rushing all over the world to capture these exotic places that usually could be visited only by the well-to-do and adventurous. Niagara Falls, Egypt, the Alps. Pictures were purchased and hung on the parlor walls all over the world. In the 1850s, the stereoscope expanded the already booming market for pictures of scenic places and exotic people. The camera provides a clear representation of what the human eye sees, but doesn't always notice. In the beginning, it was used as a copier of nature. People trusted the photos because it was thought the camera does not lie. These are the photos of John Thompson. He was a Scotsman who spent 10 years in the Orient in the 1860s, 5 years in China. He published Illustrations of China and Its People in 4 volumes. People saw every building stone, human posture, every detail of clothing. These were brimming with information that people could study. Thompson made the photographs serve as the viewer's vicarious experience. No one thought these were art, least of all Thompson. His purpose was to simply instruct, but in documenting previously undocumented things, he did produce a body of work which, to quote Beaumont Newhall, the end-all and be-all of photo historians, that sense of the immediacy and authenticity of documentation which a photograph can impart so forcibly. Now, there were other photographers. Sir Benjamin Stone in England. He was fascinated with things closer to home. It was the Edwardians and the Victorians that kept ancient customs alive. These men are drinking to the Duke's health, 1899. Dressed in their Sunday best, neighbors of the Duke of Blechlech, excuse my pronunciation, drink his health in rum and milk. By centuries-old custom, they paid him a small annual road toll called the Roth Silver, and he provided them with a lavish breakfast at the Dun Cow. A very agreeable arrangement. This is the Maundy Thursday ceremony. Local parks. For 40 years, he cataloged British life to portray, for the benefit of future generations, the manners and customs, the festivals and pageants, the historic buildings and places of our time. Those are stocks sitting next to that, right there next to that newsboy. 25,000 prints survive. The great body of his work was produced in his spare time. He was a glassmaker, a civic leader, a member of parliament. Happily, he was wealthy because the 30,000 pounds he spent on photography back at the turn of that century would be the equivalent probably to $1 million today. This was one of his most famous images. The park, the horse, the wagon. It was very exciting. Very exciting. Jacques-Henri Letigue. He came to photography at a very, very young age. When he was 7, he tried to fix images in his mind by blinking 3 times. It didn't work, and the lad fell into a deep, deep depression. Doctors were called in. No cure could be found. His dad, in a moment of genius, bought the boy a camera. Cured! From that moment, for the next 70 years, he documented his zany family and shared it with the rest of us. His photos have spontaneity, humorous, unposed freshness, and a generosity of spirit. Of course, they were terribly wealthy, so you get to see what the other half, what their lives were like. Here they are flying this glider, and it has broken away. You can see the guides flapping there, and the people don't realize what's happening yet. All those rich and fussy ladies. Now this one is kind of interesting. You didn't normally do things like this. Soldiers marching. They loved airplanes. Soldiers marching. The airplane in the air is the only thing in focus, which gives you a kind of view into what's coming. Jacob Riis fought the slums in New York. In 1888, with the invention of magnesium powder flares, a little group was lighting up the slums of New York. They were among the worst in the world. The Lower East Side was packed with immigrants. The health board called it the typhus ward. They estimated there were 522 people to the acre. Look how many people are crammed into this tiny little room. This might have been a coal chute. I mean, people were packed into every inch. Riis felt the officials were doing little about it. The Bureau of Statistics actually called it the suicide ward. Riis believed that the filth and overcrowding of the slums were the causes of their crime and disease, and that the afflictions could be cured only by eliminating the causes. He was a writer, but he couldn't find any photographers who could take the taxing hours and the visits to the slums, so he became a photographer. Now this is where the children would play, in the alley. You'd hang your laundry, toss your kids out. There was something called piecework. You might finish your job and be sent home with piecework, and everyone in the family would take part in this. So this whole family is working except for the child who's too little. Look at this woman. Look how filthy she is. Her living conditions are so filthy. She has given up. His stories and his pictures had an effect. Flop houses were abolished. Lights were installed in hallways of tenements. Playgrounds were built for schools. This is a very famous place that he got shut down. Let me see it is called the infamous Bend. For the price of a beer, if you didn't have any place to live, you could go in here, buy the beer, put your head down on the table, and sleep. Playgrounds were built for schools. Look at how crowded this schoolroom is. After hours clubs for kids were established. Clean water was made available. This is a school for after hours. These kids worked all day and then went to school. It's no wonder they look so exhausted. Riis accomplished this by means of 7 books, newspaper articles, magazine articles, lectures. In time, he was called the emancipator of the slums. He is remembered as the man who demonstrated the camera's power as a weapon for social reform and gave documentary photography a theme that has preoccupied it to this day. Another crusader was Louis Hine. He worked at abolishing child labor. Documentary photography moved out of the slums and into the country. Hine was a school teacher who left the classroom. He relied on the camera to tell the story. He wrote very little. These are miners, breaker boys. They separated by hand the useless slate from a mine's yield of coal. These boys were supposed to be 14, but they would take you as young as 6. They would work adult hours. Messenger boys, 6, 7, 8. You notice it's after dark. As young as 5, they were out hawking newspapers. And what really makes this is the rich lady walking by with that glance at the camera, that 5-year-old child out there. They worked in coal mines. They worked all day in mills. Little fingers were used where large ones couldn't reach. Between 1908 and 1921, he made 5,000 images of the little drudges in factories, mines, mills, and tenements, bowling alleys. This would not be considered so bad using these little kids to set up the pins if we didn't know that it was at 3 o'clock in the morning when these little children, the pin boys, are setting them up. The city streets. This young boy, see that empty sleeve? He lost his arm in a mill. Piecemeal workers. Remember we talked about those? They could make less than 10 cents an hour. This family is producing sock garters. A New York State survey in 1912 found that 25% of those working at home were under 10 years of age. 45% of them were under 14. This is a North Carolina cotton mill. There were 40,000 children under the age of 16 employed in the cotton mills. These people were so poor, they had to put their children in the mills. So Hines persuaded the voting public and the legislators of the urgent need for reform. We're going to talk more about crusading photographers in a later lecture. Right now, we're looking at images from a book called To the Ends of the Earth. These are those travel photographs that became so famous. This era was one of great exploration. The poles were unknown places, as was the heart of Africa and some of Asia. Where the explorers went, now photographers went with them. Robert Peary, with a blockade and 4 Eskimos, claimed to have reached the North Pole in 1909. Since then, this has been called into question, but he certainly reached farthest north at the time. They launched from Greenland. The Eskimos were people unknown to most. Some of these photos were taken by Peary himself. Personally, I find these polar photos some of the most fascinating ever taken. When I look at these photos, I think I know some of the wonder earlier people felt when they were looking at strange and exotic places and people like Greece and Italy. You have to go pretty far afield now to impress people, but these make me feel like I'm looking at something strange and exotic and cold. Aren't they gorgeous? This is the kind of place you could end up if you weren't careful. They make people feel small in a very, very large landscape, don't they? Here in America, we had the native people. The photographers for the government-sponsored expeditions into the West took the earliest Indian portraits. Among the most important were Adam Clark Vorman, whose images of the Hopi and the Zuni are some of the most sensitive ever taken. Sewell, Will Sewell, a cameraman hired by the Army to photograph the construction of Fort Sill in Indian Territory. That's a young Geronimo, top left. And the most prolific of all, Edward Curtis. These photos are actually taken from the American Image. We'll get to Curtis pretty quickly. So they felt these things are vanishing. These people are vanishing. Manifest destiny is coming to America. We're going to march all over this continent. We're going to do it in wagons. We're going to put people where there never were people of our sort before, but there were people there before, certainly. The cowboy, The sheer joy of being out west. New machines were conquering these fields of grain. You've probably seen this one. It's one of the land rushes. And this is the town of Guthrie, right after its founding. Manifest Destiny. Here it was. Spreading across America. Factories. That's where you need those little fingers. Here we are in the mills, loading the railroads. New York City. New machines there, new machines on the plains, boats at Pittsburgh. It was pretty astonishing. That's a pretty bad slide. That's Thomas Edison and Coney Island. New careers. That's Lewis Hine. He was a true artist as well as a crusader. Steel. The steel mills. Brand new cities springing up. Brooklyn Bridge. The national pastime. This is a Steichen view of New York. Then you had the immigrants pouring in. Steichen's The Steerage, a very famous image. Ellis Island. If you ever get the chance, go see Ellis Island. Some of your great-grandparents probably came through there. I know my grandparents did. It's very touching. The tenements, the new farms, and then we come to Edward Curtis. These photos are taken from Visions of a Vanishing Race by Edward Curtis. He traveled tribe to tribe for 3 decades. He used a glass plate 14 by 17-inch camera on his first voyage to Alaska before the turn of the century to a 6 by 8 sheet film reflex model used on his final visit to the same place in 1927. He made 40,000 exposures. Curtis wasn't fancy, no exposure meters, no filters, no gadgets, just a camera, a tripod, a focusing cloth, and film. He developed his film at night, and the next day on printing out paper or sometimes on blueprint paper, he used the sun to expose in a printing frame the day's work. Sometimes he would scribble instructions to his printers in Seattle. On one image of a man riding a horse, dangling something from a rope as he raced by, make this look like a chicken. It was a chicken on the way to the pot, but Curtis wanted to make sure it looked like one, so he instructed his studio, retouch as needed. Curtis was handsome, and his studio catered to society girls in Seattle. This is Princess Angelina. This is his first Indian photo. Digging clams. And here's Curtis. When you went to his studio, he was usually out chasing Indians. Your picture was taken by an assistant. He started with Princess Angeline, a famous local figure digging clams. At $1 a picture, she would rather spend her time having pictures made than digging clams. He visited a reservation and he earned their trust. Bad editing, guys, sorry. He was a mountain guide to a bunch of scientists who got lost. He bedded them down and, acting as their guide, got them over the mountains. They turned out to be men of eminence. The head of the U.S. Biological Survey was there. Gifford Pinchot, chief of forestry for the U.S. government, later governor of Pennsylvania. The editor of Forest and Stream magazine was in the party, as were conservationists and naturalists. As a result of this meeting, in 1898, he was invited to go along as the official photographer on an expedition to Alaska, sponsored by E.H. Harriman, the railroad magnate. Among the group were John Muir and John Burroughs, very famous naturalists who spent most of the survey in heated arguments with each other. Curtis and his assistant made 5,000 images and traveled 9,000 miles. They reached all the way nearly to Siberia. The following summer, Curtis and Grinnell visited the Blackfeet and saw the Sundance. To Curtis, it was something that might never be seen again. Curtis stood alone in making a systematic survey. He wants a photographic history of the American Indian. He was encouraged by Teddy Roosevelt, who wrote letters to people who could help with the project. He was a society photographer after all, so there's Teddy and his daughter on her wedding day, but that's not where his heart was. It was here. Curtis was encouraged by Teddy. He wrote letters to people who could help. 30 years and 80 tribes later, from Alaska to Mexico, 40,000 photos, 10,000 wax recordings on cylinders, writing thousands of words, all comprising an ethnological masterwork without equal. He got into some places that white people aren't supposed to be. This is a very sacred item that he got a picture of. He was not above bribing people, by the way. Here he is out in the field. He got things that we will never, ever see again. I think when the Navajo women who make these rugs die, no one will replace them. One of the criticisms about Curtis was, oh, you know, he made it up. They weren't like this. Well, maybe not. I mean, he would tell you that if there was a wire running from poles, he wasn't going to pose the Indians in front of that. He certainly wasn't going to. He was going to turn the camera around and show the natural landscape like it used to be. There are pictures of his car sitting next to a teepee, and before he took the photograph, he moved the car. Well, of course he moved the car. I drive up to houses in my car, but before I take the photograph of the outside of the house, I certainly move the car. Now, there are pictures that were taken. There is a shirt that I have seen on 4 different men in 4 different tribes, same shirt. So he carried it around, and it was a beaded shirt, and used it when he needed to. When he was working, there were no vacations. You didn't take a weekend off. 16-hour days, 7 days a week after week, year after year, he passed from a young man to an old man on this project. Now, these are sacred turtle drums. It's said that he paid a couple $100 to get this. I don't know if it's true. I don't put it past him. He needed money to finish. Teddy Roosevelt stepped in. He introduced him to J.P. Morgan of Wall Street. Curtis proposed 20 volumes of pictures and text. Sorry. This is, I'm not going back at this point. To be published in a limited set of 500 each. Each book came with a portfolio of prints, all sold by subscription. They chose handmade paper. The price was $3,000 on vellum, $3,850 for the Van Gelder paper. Morgan would put up $75,000 towards Curtis's expenses. $15,000 a year for 5 years. In return, he would get 25% of the sets along with the portfolios. The volumes were published as he completed them. In 1913, J.P. Morgan died. Only 9 volumes were finished. The Sun called him. He thought he would be fired and the project ended. But the project was still on. Now, the terms got quite a bit steeper. More control of the money that was going to be earned went to Morgan instead of Curtis. But he had a way to finish. At the end of the season, in 1910, he arrived home, he went to bed, and didn't leave it for 10 days. He went on the road with a pictorial musical, trying to earn money. He always needed money to finish. Pictures, music, stories. He rented halls, he hired musicians, he did it all. The reviews were great. The audiences were large. Unfortunately, the cost to produce exceeded the gate. Being further in debt, he decided to create a film company. That's an octopus hunter, by the way. His first tribe to be filmed was the, excuse this, Quackadoodle. I'm sure that's totally incorrect. They were delighted to participate. They usually got arrested for wearing the old masks. I'm sorry, that's a great photo and you can't see it. And holding certain ceremonies. Curtis was paying them and the authorities were looking the other way. This really was a win-win. The film was called In the Land of the Headhunters. He added some things that weren't native to the tribe, like a whale hunt. There were skulls. There was some dispute about where they came from. It was quite bombastic. The critics loved it, and it vanished into obscurity. It was a financial disaster. World War I had just broken out, and the people wanted to see evil Germans, not Indians. This is from the snake dance. In 1916, Clara, his wife, filed for divorce. She got the house and the studio and everything in them, including Curtis's equipment and his original glass negatives. It was a bitter divorce. Before turning over the studio to Clara, his daughter Beth and 2 assistants printed many gold tones and copied some of the negatives onto celluloid film. Then they took the glass negatives across the street and smashed them. Beth and Curtis moved to LA and opened a new studio, which Beth ran. Curtis laid low for a few years. He got a job as a still photographer for the movies. His first job was on the Tarzan movie. It was a living. Cecil B. DeMille hired Curtis as a researcher for the 10 Commandments. There they are in the field. In 1928, in an effort to get the money to finally finish the project, he signed the copyright to the photographs over to the Morgan Company, which meant he would never see a profit from them. He's a medicine man, grinding medicine. When the project was finally finished, with a last trip to Alaska, on the way home, he stopped into Seattle, his old hometown. It's been 30 years. He's been through a divorce. He's lost everything. He's lost his youth. No one was there to meet his ship. No one was there. That's his daughter, Beth. That's who belongs in the kayak. No one was there to greet him at all. until he got to the train station where he was arrested by the police for failing to pay 7 years of alimony, totaling $4,500. The judge found that Clara had filed 20 court actions against Curtis since the divorce and let him go. He became a miner for gold. He never struck it rich. He then decided to write about it. The Lure of Gold never saw print. He tried to join a South American survey expedition to explore the Amazon. He was nearly 80. In 1952, he died of a heart attack at the home of his daughter. A short obit in the New York Times mentioned he had been an authority on Indian history, and he had also been a photographer. This picture's also kind of famous. Remember when I said he didn't let modern things show? That bowl, just right of center, left of the man on the right, was an alarm clock, and the retouchers made it into a bowl. There's never been anything like this series. I'm pretty sure there'll never be anything like it ever again. And we are so lucky that he was such an artist and so dedicated, because he was right. Most of this is gone, never, ever to be seen again. That's the Hopi tribe. You can tell by the hairdo. The young unmarried women wore their hair like that. Edward Curtis. There's a couple good books about him. That's the photograph that he pulled his car out of the way. That's probably a painted Kiowa teepee. They're pretty famous from his last shoot. All right, until next time.